start the live stream. Just some seconds to synchronize. And then I first like to introduce our guest today, Stephen Barstow. And I'd like to tell a little anecdote. So I was on a trip in Bulgaria to a TPT, that's a teaching permaculture teachers course. And I was sitting in the bus next to Eirik, and Eirik is from Norway. And he was chatting with me about different permaculture related stuff. And then he got somehow very excited. And he was like, there was this plant exchange with KVANN, the seed savers. And he was like, I had Stephen Barstow at my desk and he picked my Angelica, Arch Angelica. And I was like, Stephen who? So I didn't know the name during that time, didn't know the person. And then a little bit later, we had a lecture here at the PermaPuheet with Anevi Sjöberg. And at the end of her lecture, she was talking about resources. And then she went like, oh, there is this plant nerd in Norway. His name is Stephen Barstow, and he has this book with 80 plants around the world. And I was like, Stephen Barstow, I know that name. I have to check his website now. I have to go there. And then last year's PermaPuheet, we had Andrew McMillan, and he was like, Stephen is my go-to guy if I have questions about plants. So I'm very honored today to have Stephen Barstow here. So Stephen, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic, and thank you so much for inviting me finally to Finland. I've never been to Finland, despite the fact I've lived here in Norway for over 40 years now. And since my book came out in 2014, I spent a lot of time traveling around the world talking about the book and visited over 20 countries all around the world, including all the Nordic countries apart from Finland. It just didn't happen somehow. So anyway, I can now do this talk by Zoom from my desk, and I don't have to have all that traveling to do, which is I decided to stop traveling when COVID came along and taught me that being at home was I really enjoyed being at home. So that's the end of my traveling days, and from now on it's going to be Zoom. So welcome everybody to my living room here in Malvik in Norway on the edge of the Trondheimsfjord. You can see my house in the first slide. I presume you can see my slide okay. This is a summer shot of part of the garden that most resembles a forest garden. Of course, at the moment, it looks very, very different. I hope the internet holds because we've got a bit of a storm going on here. I think it's on the way to you guys in Finland as well at the moment. But let's just go on to the next. Oh, what's happening? Doesn't seem to move. What's up? We should have tried more than one slide. I don't see what's happening. Oh, here we go. Don't know why that didn't move on. So this is a bit more of an aerial shot, and it's a relatively small garden, 2,300 square meters, 0.6 acres. It became known as the edible garden, mainly because, well, I'm a bit of a collector. I've got collectomania. My dad collected stamps. I had to collect something, and it turned out that it was going to be edible plants of the world, inspired initially by the Plants for a Future database and the fact that when I moved to Norway in 1981, I was a vegetarian, and I moved to a country where I just couldn't understand where all the vegetables were. They just didn't seem to exist. Both vegetables and alcohol weren't in the shops. And I kind of joke that I reckon at that time that both the vegetables and the alcohol were illegal. But finally, I understood that Norwegians just didn't eat many vegetables. Probably the country worldwide that has the least traditions of eating vegetables, particularly foraged vegetables from nature. Of course, all that has turned around now. And so in order to survive as vegetarians here just outside of the city of Trondheim, we had to start growing our own and foraging. Luckily, we very early on got in contact with a national organization called the Nytteväxtforening, or the Norwegian Useful Plant Society, that is really one of the very few organizations worldwide that, if not the only one, that is a national organization devoted to foraging, and it goes back over 100 years here in Norway. So that was vegetables in the supermarket, or just 3 or 4 of the usual ones like carrots and cabbage, etc. I met up with a group of young people in their 20s at that time, inspired by the Food for Free movement in other parts of Europe at that time in the 1970s, who knew a huge diversity of wild plants, not only the berries and the fungi, which were available in the autumn, but also wild edible plants, which I could find on the shoreline below my house in the springtime. Anyway, today the garden is known as the Edible Garden, or Den Spiselige Hagen in Norwegian, and it's part of 2 networks. KVANN, you've already mentioned, the Norwegian Seed Saver organization. I won't say too much about that tonight because I understand that Andrew Macmillan in the previous talked quite a bit about what we do in the Norwegian Seed Savers. But part of we have a network called Schubler's Network, which is a national network of inspiration gardens. If you go into the KVANN website, which is kvann.no, then you can find more information about this network and who this guy Schubler was. The garden is also became a permaculture land centre about 4 or 5 years ago now. So the garden it is possible to contact me and ask if you can come and have a look around. So I have quite a few visitors every year, and we have organized walk and talks around the garden a few times every year. Looking from above, you can get an idea already of the diversity of the plants. At one time, there was something, as you mentioned in the notes, there was something like I built up a collection of something like 2,000 edible plants in the garden, and the vast majority were perennial plants. So by perennial, I mean plants that come back year after year. And as opposed to most of the conventional vegetables that we grow, which are annual plants. The basic garden is oriented north-south. Can you see my pointer? Yeah. So the garden is oriented north-south, and it's at the outset, it was a very shady garden. There were even more trees than there are today. The previous owners had been actually quite interested in birds, and we discovered there, and that fitted very well into my own interest when I was a student in Edinburgh in Scotland, from where I moved to Norway in '81. I'd become interested in nature and particularly birds. I'd begun to learn the songs and the names, etc. And when it came to choosing a place to live, here in Malvik. We wanted a place that was good for the birds, in addition to the fact that we wanted to grow our own food because of the difficulty of finding vegetables in the supermarkets. And it was a bit of a gamble choosing this house because it really was a very shady garden. You can see there are big trees here. There are big birch trees. There are spruce trees. There are actually, we counted something like 15 different species of tree and bush when we moved here. So already there was quite a diversity for this far north in the world. And the thing that really persuaded us to buy the place was that there was wild hazel growing on the land. And as you know, hazel is associated with, has a big diversity of birds associated with it. Birds like the nuthatch, woodpeckers, and the Siberian nutcracker, which has become a breeding bird in this part of the world. Originally, it migrated in years where there was very little food. Generally eat Siberian pine nuts, and in some years when there's a crop failure, they fly westwards to Finland and on to Norway, to places where they could also find hazelnuts. And the Siberian nutcracker one year arrived here near Trondheim, and they discovered that actually people had planted the Siberian pine around the city in the 1970s, and they were now producing nuts. So they discovered that this this bird discovered its food plant actually available locally around Trondheim, and a few of those birds stayed to breed. So nowadays we have a local breeding population of the Siberian nutcracker, totally isolated from the original Siberian species, which is quite a lot of fun. So every autumn now we get the Siberian nutcrackers coming into the garden and harvesting the hazelnuts, which they cache up in the forest. But in addition, we're caching the Siberian pine nut in my own garden. I actually saw them doing this one year, and that has resulted in Siberian pine germinating and now I have quite a few quite large Siberian pine trees which have started producing nuts. So the bird itself has spread its own food supply. So that was that, and of course squirrels as well. So this is where I'm living in Malvik at 63.4 degrees north. This shows on the western side of Norway, but not on the outer coast, so it's somewhat colder where I am. The absolute minimum temperature over the years I've lived here has been about -23. This winter it hasn't really gone down much below -10, but there are large swings in the climate, as I'm sure you know in Finland as well. That it was only 10 years ago we had the coldest winter ever in this part of the world, where it froze solid and the soil didn't defreeze of April that year. This year there's no ice at all in the soil, so I was actually out digging a little bit today. And a bit of a close-up. We're right on the southern edge of the Trondheimsfjord, which is volume-wise the biggest fjord in Norway, I believe. And in the winter, the fjord actually represents warmth because it never freezes. It never goes below about +6 degrees centigrade, and maybe higher than that this winter. So when the really cold winds are coming from the east, the winds blow over the sea and warm up so that we have a relatively mild climate. But at the same time, that results in the fact we don't get very stable snow conditions. And in some winters, there can be no snow and it can go down to -20. And in that particular winter I mentioned 10 years ago, we had basically, there's very little soil in the garden, probably no more than about maximum 20 centimeters of soil over a very fertile rock called phyllite. And that winter it froze solid right down to the bedrock for something like 4 months, whereas this winter it hasn't frozen at all. So we're getting these extremes, swinging one way up to the other every other winter. So it's a bit of a challenge. So all the plants in my garden have to survive those kind of conditions, which is more severe in many ways for perennial vegetables, because they basically die down to the ground. They're herbaceous. They die down to the ground every autumn, and they're not exposed to the very low temperatures in the air that bushes and trees are. In winters where there's no snow cover, they're very exposed there. So it's a very different for trees and bushes, which can be are basically exposed to the very cold temperatures. Anyway, so further inland, only a few kilometers inland from where I'm living, there's much more stable snow, and that insulates those same plants. So in that way, my garden is a good test bed for hardiness. Yeah, so I have this, as I mentioned, I had this big collection of edible plants that actually back in 2003, I became known as the extreme salad man, because I made a salad of 538 different, huge diversity. And over the years since that time, I regularly make salads with over 100 species. So all these salads we could see on this slide were made with over 100 different plants that are harvested from my garden. And many of the edible flowers. I made a winter salad actually at this time of year, the beginning of March, with 140 different plants, without using any heating or extra lights or anything like that. Just an old house with a good cold cellar, which I'm very fortunate with. I introduced my diet. 80 a day keeps the doctor away. With that, try it. I made a salad with 115 edible flowers one year. I made a pesto with 230 different onions. And with the help of a Finnish woman, actually, who lives in Norway, Rita Amundsen, we made a ferment with 412 different plants. Yeah, crazy. Why do it? Well, I can do it, so why not? And at Christmas time one year, we made, typically at Christmas, we use a big diversity of tubers, which is the thing in winter. So Christmas 2013, we used 25 different tubers in our Christmas dinner. And it all culminated in my book, Around the World in 80 Plants, which came out in 2014, which basically takes you on a journey around the world. Each plant can be associated with a geographic location, and this is shown here. Today, as I mentioned to you, Dominic, at the beginning when we were talking, the whole talk Around the World in 80 Plants takes something like 5 hours. So when I told him that, he said, no. Don't worry, I've selected only a few today, and I'd also like time to talk a little bit about 2 of my other projects. I'm involved in 2 other gardens here in Trøndelag. but we take our inspiration. So in the book, I talk about my 80 favorite perennial vegetables, because it turned out that the perennials under my conditions, shady conditions, grew better than the standard annual plants that I've been growing. So I've transitioned more and more over to a perennial diet. And today, actually for the last 20 years, I've been more or less self-sufficient in vegetables, fruit and berries. Not nuts, unfortunately, as yet. We're working on that. Really, I don't have enough space in my garden for big walnut trees. So that was a little introduction. Now I thought I'd talk a little bit about the plants, which is my first love. And I've selected a few plants from the book. Just earlier today, I searched through the book for mentions of Finland and Finnish, and discovered that actually Finland had been mentioned in something like 20 different plants in the book, and probably the vast majority of the books, the perennial vegetables in my book are can be grown in Finland. So these are a few of the plants with a Finnish connection in my book. The first one is probably the perennial vegetable that I'm best known for outside of Scandinavia, at least. It's Hablitsia tamnoides, and I've tried to include the Finnish name of all the plants in red at the bottom right. I have absolutely no idea how to pronounce them, so please don't ask me. I could if you like, if you want a bit of entertainment. But this plant, Hablitsia tamnoides, the Caucasian spinach, was really what first started to attract permaculturists to my garden. And I'll explain in a minute why that happened. But I first came across this book in the early 2000s, thanks to a Swedish author, Lena Israelsson, who I was in contact with and trading. I traded a lot over the internet for the seeds and plants I wanted. And I was in contact with her because she was researching a book on alliums, on onions. And I sent her seed of various onions that I was growing here in Trondheim. And she sent this book back to me as a thank you. And to my big surprise, there was this plant I'd never heard of before called Hablitsia tamnoides, or rankspinat in Swedish. I looked it up on the net. I found almost nothing. It was totally missing from the major ethnobotanical source books on edible plants like Cornucopia 2. It wasn't mentioned in the plants for a future database on the net. What is this plant, I wondered. So I asked her for more details and asked her, well, have you got some seed? So Lena actually sent me some seed in 2001, 2002, and that plant is still alive today. It's still vigorous, and this is what it basically looks like in the early spring to the left, and midsummer. It's a climbing spinach. It's related to it's the only species in the Hablitsia genus. Comes from the Caucasus, and therefore we call it it's been called the Caucasian spinach. And it's I'd started growing this plant, and it's closely related to Good King Henry, if you know that one, Canopodium bonus henricus, which to me is a disgustingly horrible tasting salad plant. I included it in my book, and I called it bad because the process is in some way to be able to eat it. At least that's my experience. And I know others have the same experience. So it's closely related to that plant, and it's sometimes confused with that plant, but good King Henry isn't a climber. And unlike that plant, the raw shoots of Hablitzia are really mild and good tasting. And it's incredibly early. It starts, as I mentioned, early in the spring. This is early April in my garden, maybe the end of March. Actually, the shoots start sprouting already in the late autumn and can stand very low temperatures throughout the winter, even though it's they're already a few centimeters high above the ground. Yeah, sorry. Perfect to use as a spinach crop, both the young shoots and also the older leaves later in the summer. Of course, this was the first article I wrote for Permaculture magazine in the UK. The Caucasian spinach, the unknown woodlander. Nobody had heard of it before at that time. But it turns out to be the foremost perennial vegetables for, in particular, northern cold climates. People trying to grow it in very warm climates struggle. So actually, this is a plant which grows better with us than probably most other parts of Europe. So us in the north in Scandinavia. So that article started a series of articles and ended up with my book, Around the World in 80 Plants. There's a Finnish connection here because in around about 2008, I got funding from the Nordic Gene Bank in Sweden. We'd heard that there were plants that had survived right up to the current day of this plant, which had been introduced as an ornamental plant in the 1870s to Sweden and Finland and also to Norway. And individual plants had managed to survive totally neglected in old gardens around Scandinavia. And I was given money to try and collect seed and plant material from these old relic Hablitzia plants. It kind of went out of fashion in the 1920s when other climbing plants with big flowers turned up. But up until that time, it was a recognized ornamental plant, in addition to the fact that people already at that time discovered that it was good to eat. We have records in Norway back in the 1890s where this is discussed. And as part of that project, I got a lot of help from a lady, a lecturer at the University of Helsinki, Lena Linden, and her student Lena Nurmi. And they managed to locate something like 6 or 7 old plants just in Finland and collected seed for me, which they sent to me, and we sent them on to the Nordic Gene Bank for safekeeping. And Lena Nurmi did a master's thesis a few years ago now on the nutrition of Hablitzia, and discovered that actually Hablitzia had a better nutritional profile than even spinach and New Zealand spinach, which you could think of comparing it with. And at the same time had relatively low levels of oxalic acid and other things that we might be concerned with. As I was giving this talk today, and as I mentioned in my book, at the top here is a little excerpt from my book where I actually mention Finland. And I mentioned the fact that I had discovered at that time when I was writing my book that somebody had made, how do you pronounce that? Pinatiohukas, which in English is Finnish Hablitzia pancakes. Well, that word isn't, but a spinach pancakes, and spinach can be always replaced by Hablitsia in recipes. So I thought it would be fun today, as I was coming to Finland, to make Finnish Hablitsia pancakes for my lunch today. So this is what they look like. I don't really do recipes. This is what Hablitsia looks in my garden today. They've already come along. We've had quite a mild period the last week, and they've already come to this kind of stage. So they're a decent size for collecting. So I collected a decent amount from the garden and mixed them with, well, I used oatmeal. I don't use wheat flour, so all grain oatmeal, and mixed it with garlic, chili, a few eggs, and basically whizzed it all up and made it into kind of flat pancakes in the frying pan. Probably not a very authentic Finnish recipe, but I can't really be bothered with recipes. I just get stuck in. It takes too much time. And so this was the result of the Finnish Hablitsia pancakes today, with a little salad which also had Hablitsia in it. So it really is a great vegetable at this time of year, when we're really even before what we traditionally called the hungry gap. It was, I've still got vegetables in the cellar, so this just supplements that. The next plant, now we're going to a little series of plants which the Sami people, do you say Sami in Finland as well? The Sami people, what traditionally would. So the Sami people, unlike, in speaking about the Norwegians anyway, unlike the Norwegians used the minimum of vegetables possible, the Sami people, of course, used quite a large amount of vegetables, which helped them through the winters. They didn't get scurvy, obviously. We don't hear much about the vegetables of the Sami people, but of course they stomach with reindeer milk, and that fermented vegetable could then be preserved in a cool place right through the following winter. And one of those plants that they used, both fresh and fermented, was Angelica, Archangelica, the plant we in Norway call KVANN, which is also the name of our seed saver organization. It's really a plant which is found in the wild all the way from Scandinavia to the Himalaya. And wherever it grows, it was used traditionally as a food plant. Even the Norwegians were crazy about Angelica. They would walk for days up into the mountains to collect the flower stems of the Angelica plants. The flower stems, unlike the very young shoots of Angelica, which are already up in my garden, which are quite strong tasting. The flower stems, when they're peeled, are very almost sweet tasting. So it really was the candy of the day. So people would go for long walks up into the mountains to harvest these flower shoots. And as a result, it's not strictly a perennial plant. It can take 3 or 4 years to flower, but once it's flowered and set seed, it dies. So when people harvested the flower shoots, the plants would often die in response. And because this was one of the first wild plants in Norway to be over-harvested. And still today, the amounts of this plant in the Norwegian mountains is much less than before. Vossekvarn, bottom right, is a plant which is a kind of a cultivar of kvarn. The normal or the wild plant, you'll find that the stems have a big hole in the middle. The Vossekvarn is almost filled completely with harvestable vegetable, and probably the plant is producing the same amount of these bitter chemicals, which are insect defense basically. It has a milder taste for us, so it's more acceptable to even to use the younger shoots of the Vossequan. And it's in Norway become a heritage plant, which we in the Norwegian Seed Savers organization are working with to conserve. It was discovered growing still in 4 different mountain farms in the Voss area in Western Norway, southwestern Norway. So Vossequan is one of our more important heritage vegetables even today. Yeah, other Angelica species around the world, I talk about quite a few of them in my book. There are something like 50 different species around the Northern Hemisphere, and all growing in fairly cold climates, and more or less all of them were traditionally used by the local peoples, local indigenous peoples around, including this one here, which is often also grown as an ornamental, the Korean Angelica, Angelica gigas. Has these beautiful red flower stems, and the flower stems themselves are also very sweet tasting at this stage. A delicious vegetable, but again, it dies after flowering. It's not truly a perennial. And then we have sorrel, Rumex acetosa, which was another extremely important food plant for the Sami people. It tends to love to grow on ground which has been fertilized by the reindeer. So where look around, the sorrel would come in and colonize, and the people would the Sami people would actually go back to these places where they'd herded the reindeer to harvest the sorrel. A kind of primitive gardening, if you like, and it wouldn't surprise me they actually spread the seed in the muck as well to help things along. But otherwise, I think when I think of sorrel, it's a plant which grows all the way again from Scandinavia to the Himalayas and throughout, a very important vegetable. It's a plant that children love to eat. They love sour things. There are some candies which are modeled on the sour taste of sorrels, actually. And yeah, so why can't we buy sorrel in the supermarket? For the kids love it, but in Scandinavia, maybe in Finland you have it. I know in Estonia, in Russia, it's a very important vegetable. France, sold in supermarkets. Very easy to grow here, but you have to harvest it or grow it yourself. Top left is a non-flowering variety of sorrel, which I grow in my garden. I have 2 different types, which more or less never flower and set seed. So they use all their energy in producing leaves. So it's a more productive plant compared to the wild. If you moved a wild plant into your garden, it would very quickly set seed, flower and set seed. Okay, the various other ones there. One year I was alerted to the fact that an Estonian seed catalogue had 6 different varieties of Russian sorrels. So they're real cultivars of sorrel. Of course, I bought them all and did a little trial in my garden to find an even better one. So I've been selecting sorrels for as vegetables here. Okay, and then there's hapro, perhaps Oxyria digyna, or the mountain sorrel is another important, another sorrel which I grow in my garden and actually prefer the taste to the other sorrel. Another Sami vegetable. Sometimes you get red forms like this. We have Temperate, Cicibita alpina, which is actually a very strong tasting vegetable. Again, it was mainly the flower shoot that was used. And also fermenting this vegetable. This was really one of the top, most important Sami vegetables, which was fermented. And I think probably the fermentation process gave a milder taste. But it's all about disguising the bitterness of these plants. Generally, most perennial vegetables are not that strong tasting, at least the ones I talk about in my book. But there are exceptions like this one, which have an interesting ethnobotanical record, and they also double as ornamental plants in the gardens. You can also just put a bucket over the plant in the springtime to blanch them, and that also gives for a milder taste. Another Sami vegetable, at least in southern Norway, in my area, the Sami people in the mountains around where I live, they seem to have moved to this wild plant, Campanula latifolia, the giant bellflower, from nature to places where they lived. So I suspect the Sami people were actually the original forest gardeners in this part of the world. Moving one of their favorite vegetables into the forest so they could easily harvest it in the summer. And those plants have carried, even though the Sami people are not using that plant any longer, as far as I know in this area, the plants are still there and they've spread quite nicely. Otherwise, it's more or less a coastal plant here in Norway. Fantastic, productive perennial vegetable in my garden, which is truly perennial, coming back year after year. I'm sure some of the plants in my garden are over 40 years old now. And they also are great ornamentals, these lovely white and purple flowers in midsummer. And they also has edible roots. So if you want to sacrifice a plant, you can also use these sweet tasting roots of Campanula latifolia. There are various other plants in the bellflower family, like this one, the nettle leaf bellflower, which are edible. They're all edible, basically. The phytomas or the rampions, fantastic combination of food and beauty, plants that I call edimental. So we'll come back to. And then we also have the balloon flower from the Far East, which is an important root vegetable there. But more or less all the Campanulaceae bellflower family can be, you can have a taste of, usually mild tasting. I could talk for hours about the onions. I mention a bit later the onion garden I've been developing here in Trondheim. But one of our favorite northern Norway onions is the victory onion, Allium victorialis. Not a plant that the Sami were aware of, as far as I know. It's more or less isolated to the area around the Lofoten Islands. It's not a native plant, but it's been in the Lofoten Islands for a very long time, in particular the Vestvåg island up there. There are huge amounts of this plant growing, and it's been hypothesized that this is possibly a plant that the Vikings brought with them from southern Europe and planted originally, getting on for 1,000 years ago now. In fact, there's a big Viking museum on Vestvåg in the Lofoten Islands, where they've recreated an onion, a Viking onion garden. And there they've planted this victory onion. Around where the Viking Museum is, there are literally huge amounts of this onion, which is naturalized. And people even grow this as an ornamental plant up their driveway, totally unaware even that it's an onion and that it's edible, one of the best onions, better than Ramson's, Ramslurk, these kind of things. And when you talk to them and say, well, this is a fantastic edible plant, it's beautiful, yeah, but it's also really healthy and very productive. They then understand why, when they're mowing the grass alongside the plant, that it smells of onion. The plants are seeding themselves into the grass the whole time. Okay. Allium victorialis has a huge range geographically in nature, from the Pyrenees through the Alps, grows in the Caucasus, grows in Siberia, in Japan, Korea, and goes into the Aleutian Islands. So it's almost a circumpolar allium. In the Alps, it actually grows even above the tree line. So I imagine it would be hardy in southern Finland. Well, you have a name for it, so I assume that it's grown there. You can maybe tell me in the chat if you're growing it. But in Japan, it's also cultivated as a commercial perennial vegetable, as one of the sansai or mountain vegetables, which have become very popular to cultivate around the big cities in Japan and also in Korea and China. So these are pictures from supermarkets in Japan in the springtime. I led a victory onion safari in the Lofoten Islands. Most people go there to see the whales. This crowd came along with me to see the onions. Here you can see the huge amounts that they're harvesting here. And in some of the islands up there, there are huge amounts of this onion growing in people's gardens, and they have absolutely no idea what it is or that it's edible. So this person was struggling to grow a few potatoes, yet they had this enormous yield of victory onion, which can be used right up to flowering. Beautiful plant in flower. In Tromsø in northern Norway, they have a big collection of this plant, which we call Seierslurk or victory onion. And you can, in this Arctic city, you just can see how well this plant is growing and how well it's adapted to these Arctic conditions. In fact, generally in the Arctic areas, it amazes me that they don't all grow perennial vegetables, which are much easier to grow with often better yields than the annuals that people struggle with. Allium scorodophrasum, the sand leek. This is another fantastic perennial onion that some people in Scandinavia or in colder parts of Scandinavia grow as a replacement for leeks, the normal leek or pura, which grows rather slowly in these climates. And I suspect, and this species, I understand, grows in a few places in southern Finland as well. It's often in Norway and Sweden, associated with where it grows wild today, with old Viking settlements. So we believe this was one of the onions that the Vikings cultivated. And you know, the word garlic in English, which is a totally different species of allium. Garlic originates from Scandinavia, from the Norwegian geir lauk, geir meaning a spear, a long spear. So it was an onion which looked like a spear. So I suspect, and you can see in the top middle picture, the flowering stalk, which can be really tall and very spear-like. I think this was the original garlic of the Vikings, which was cultivated, and there's good evidence from the distribution of this plant today, also on the island of Gotland in the Baltic, where it's called cape, and there's still a tradition of making soup from this onion in the summer. Very easily grown over much of Scandinavia. Well, there are hundreds of hardy perennial vegetables that could be grown in your Finnish permaculture-inspired garden. This was just a little, I have a couple more just to tie off this part of the talk. You can read a lot more in my book. but the ones I just like to say something a bit more about are both, as far as I know, very, very hardy in Finland. First of all, hosta, which we call the Oriental spinach. This is another article I wrote in Permaculture magazine in the 2000s. Hosta, the Oriental spinach. At that time, hosta was almost unknown as an edible plant. Whereas it was one of the superstars of the ornamental garden, with 10,000 or more cultivars available, all of which, as far as I'm aware, are edible. There are no known nasty chemicals in hosta, which I believe, Hosta C. Bordiana. I included the Finnish name there, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But hosta, if you're not aware of hosta as a food plant, it really is one of the most productive, nutritious, easily grown perennial vegetables for cold climates in particular. It's the young shoots in the springtime mainly which are used. So at this stage, as you can see in these pictures, with the leaves just about unfurling, but you can also use the youngish leaves after the plant has unfurled, in particular cooked as a kind of a spinach. Again, you can use this both raw in salads, but also as a spinach replacement. Available in my area in May. This is one of the later sprouting perennial vegetables. It's nice that different ones, Hablitzia I mentioned already, which starts off already in the very early spring. This one starts much later in May to produce. In Japan, again, it's a major vegetable which is cultivated year-round in big glass houses. It's grown in fields and then moved. The roots are dug up in the autumn before the frost comes, and then it's stored cool until it's time to force these shoots. And they're often forced in the dark, usually under a layer of rice husks. So these shoots you can see at the bottom are literally translated from the Japanese are hosta icicles, because they resemble icicles. They can be almost totally white. And these are sweeter tasting. Some people have mentioned to me that they've heard from somebody else that hosta is bitter tasting or whatever. I've never experienced any bitterness in the hostas that I've tried. So it's a mild, slightly sweet vegetable which can be used in a whole range of different dishes. To the right was just marinated, quickly cooked up and marinated in a soy sauce, sesame oil dressing, as the Japanese would use it. Often they would just use the icicles dipped into a salad dressing. This here is a well-known house in England. It's also probably the most productive forest garden in the UK. When I wrote about this plant in Permaculture magazine, I mentioned that what was Prince Charles had the biggest forest garden in the UK, except he didn't know it yet. Because in that forest that you can see at the bottom there is a national collection of large-leaved hostas, growing more or less in the total darkness throughout the season that they're active. In fact, hosta, I grow my biggest hostas on the north side of my house, where there is absolutely no direct sunlight. So it's quite astonishing then that hosta actually has a very high nutritional profile in a similar way to the Hablitzia I mentioned earlier. And in Japan, here we have supermarket hosta, unfortunately wrapped up in plastic, but yeah, what's not to like about that otherwise? So everybody should be growing hosta in their forest gardens. And when you're starting a forest garden, don't forget the perennial vegetables in the ground layer. It's for me, I think it's important to start the vegetables at the same time that you're planting the trees, so that they get established before the trees tree roots start spreading. But unfortunately, that rarely seems to happen. It seems to be that the fruit and the nuts are the things which are prioritized in a forest garden. But there are many layers. This is just a view of the steepest part of my garden, and the part of the garden that most closely relates a forest garden. Unfortunately, bottom left is a list of the plants that are growing in this area, the steepest slope in my garden. It's a mix of plants which were there initially, plants like lesser celandine, ground elder. The giant bellflower has colonized, but it's a kind of a stable food forest community that's just developed mostly by itself, but I've added a few elements like the ostrich fern, which I believe you also have in Finland, very hardy plant. Not terribly productive in a forest garden, but a fun plant to have. It spreads laterally by rhizomes. And then bottom right, we have my largest perennial vegetable early on in the middle of May. This is Udo, or Aurelia cordata, which we'll come back to. Aurelia cordata, also called the Japanese asparagus. Udo is a major vegetable in Japan, and it literally within 6 weeks of starting to appear above ground in my garden every spring. For the last 20 years, this plant is over 20 years old now. It grows way over my head in the course of only 6 weeks, an incredible growth rate. And it also grows on more or less nothing. And like almost all the perennial vegetables in my garden, they never receive any fertilizer from me, just what the heavens bring, and the source rock below, which is, I'm lucky to have a fertile soil. So it's not necessary that you'll be able to copy this. You may need to fertilize as well. But these plants receive absolutely no water, fertilizer. The only work I do on them is to harvest. The ground layer, or the ground layer of lesser celandine and ground elder, these plants are so small that they don't really impact this monster in any way. So you can be completely relaxed about ground elder, for example, which a lot of people get scared of. It's one of my favorite perennial vegetables that I eat almost every day during the spring and summer months. Okay. I've got one slide here about the advantages with perma veggies. You can maybe go back. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'm almost running out of time, I think. But there are many advantages of perma veggies, as I call them, permanent vegetables, permaculture vegetables. They're much easier to grow organically, fewer insects and other diseases in springtime. There's less water requirements because after the winter, when they're growing most fastest, there's basically sufficient moisture in the soil after the long winter. They have much less need for fertilizer as the roots are more efficient throughout the season, reaching deeper into the soil. You use less energy. In the case of quite a few of the vegetables I've been talking about, these are plants which will outlive you even. So you use less energy, you plant one time, and you don't have to bother with sowing seed and plant every year. They complement traditional vegetables. They're mostly available in the spring, but you can extend the season using different techniques. Many of the perennials have a second flush of greens in the autumn, and I also dig up some of the roots of some of these vegetables like hosta and udo and quite a few others, dandelion, for example, and move into my cellar in the winter so that I have a ready supply of forced leaves throughout the winter. I basically bring them up into a warmer room a couple of weeks before I need fresh leaves. And I use in particular dandelion, which I could again talk about for hours. I use dandelion every day at the moment. And one winter I used dandelion leaves almost every day of the year. Fantastic vegetable that I've kind of got used to what today for me is a really good bitter taste, but you can also blanch them in a cold cellar at about 4 degrees centigrade, which mine is at the moment. They are sprouting and it's totally dark in my cellar. So the young sprouts are ready, blanched and milder tasting, sweeter tasting. But there are many other vegetables you can do this with, but perennials are particularly genial. You can just not worry about dandelions seeding themselves over your garden. You just dig a few up in the autumn, and there's your food for the rest of the winter. Perennials, for me, turn what was traditionally the hungry gap into what I call the full gap. It's the time of year, the time of plenty in my garden. So it's the opposite to the conventional autumn. Perennials sequester more carbon, and therefore they're much more climate friendly, and the whole forest garden concept, they fit very nicely into that concept, because a vast majority of perennial vegetables are actually forest dwelling plants originally, and they also automatically promote biodiversity in your garden, because often insects in particular are associated with one particular species or genus of plants. And many double as ornamentals, which we'll come back to. There's a quick one slide just showing some of my favorite shade-tolerant perennial vegetables. We talked about hosta, quite a few of these we've already talked about. I like to categorize my plants. I found it useful to do this. I have this category edimentals or edible ornamentals. My website is edimentals.com for that reason. This is the group of plants which are both edible and beautiful to look at when they're flowering in particular. But it could also be, in the case of hosta, that the leaves are beautiful to look at. So this is a particularly useful group of plants which have two uses, and even conventional gardeners can understand that these plants have their uses. And then I have another two groups of plants, bit of a tongue-twisting, entomentals, ento from entomology, and avimentals, avi from avian or birds. So these are insect-friendly, insect or bird-friendly edible ornamentals. So here we have 3 different uses within the same plant. And there are a number of, and I'm kind of making lists of my favorite entomentals in particular, where the pollinators are they're very popular for the pollinators when the flowers are out. So many of the alliums, in particular the thistles, like the tuberous thistle, Cirsium tuberosum, is a fantastic plant, which also is one of the few what I call quadruple value plants. In this case, this plant has edible tubers. It looks beautiful when it's flowering, so it's an ornamental. The pollinators are crazy over it. And when the seeds are produced, the birds eat the seeds. So this is a really the best of the lot, number 1. Okay, just something now to finish off this last section on the biodiversity in my edible garden. So far, as I mentioned, as a young man, I was interested in birds, and I've always made notes of what I see in the garden. In recent years, we have online reporting species reporting websites. Here in Norway, it's Artsobservasjoner. So I always note what I see in the garden and note which birds are eating which plants, etc. And so far 101 species of bird have been registered here. So pretty decent biodiversity. Actually, the first record of the red-breasted flycatcher was actually in my county. There's only one other since then, which happened last year. And in particular, goldfinches started turning up. It was a rare overwintering bird in my area. I'd been growing burdock, borre, Artium lappa, as a vegetable. It has vegetable roots, very popular in Japan. And I'd been letting them flower and set seed in the following year. The flowers, again, are very popular with the pollinators. And the seed, as it turns out, is more or less the goldfinch's exclusive food in winter. So I suddenly started getting flocks of over 20 goldfinches in my garden, one of the most beautiful birds we had, and that attracted all the bird watchers as well, because this was a real rarity in our area. This is about 15 years ago now. Now it's become much more common and has even started to breed. So it's a winter visitor originally to eat the seeds. I've already mentioned the Siberian nutcracker, so I won't dwell on that. Just planted a Siberian pine nut tree in my garden, or a few of them. Yeah, I have various plants which I plant for the butterflies. But what about the moths and other insects? Corona came along. I've always wanted to know more about what other diversity, what other life forms I was sharing my garden with. And there are some I just don't see because they're flying at night, for example, the moths. So when Corona came along, I decided to finally, I had time to try and find out what other moths and insects were here. And during the time since COVID started, I've actually recorded over 276 species of butterfly and moth in my garden. I got hold of a moth trap. You let the moths free again afterwards to get a better understanding of the diversity within the insects in my garden. And every time I found a new species, I was able to associate that species with information on the food plants that the larvae of that moth would use. And I understand then, that's why I've got that moth in my garden. I'm growing it. It's actually a vegetable even. And yet I don't notice, despite this incredible diversity of insects, I really don't notice any leaves eaten, and they really don't make a noticeable impact on my food, which I'm mainly eating in the springtime anyway, and late autumn when the butterflies and moth larvae are less active. And of course, everybody is aware of the value of having nettles in your garden, both as a food plant, for making fertilizer, for making fiber. Incredibly versatile plant. And some of you will also be aware of certain butterflies like the admiral butterfly and the small tortoiseshell, whose larvae feed on nettles. But what I hadn't totally appreciated was the huge diversity of moths in addition, which feed on nettles. So all these pictures are moths that I've found in my garden, which have been feeding on the nettles, which I've allowed to grow. And well, one of the most useful plants for me is a food plant anyway. So it's no big deal to let them grow and produce seed. In fact, in Norway, there are 54 species of butterflies and moths which have been recorded. The larvae have been recorded on nettles. And you can also grow other types of nettle. I grow this 3-meter tall California nettle in my garden, which is I imagine, a very good plant for the fibers, which also attracts butterflies and moths. But not only the insects, also the birds are very attracted to the nettles in winter when they feed on the seeds. So I make sure I don't cut down. I let quite a few plants seed themselves. And in fact, I've got a patch right outside my kitchen window so I can observe the birds feeding on the nettles in winter. What's better than providing food for the birds in winter rather than importing sunflower seeds from other parts of the world to put out on our bird feeders? So I do everything possible to attract the birds. So these are all three species: the bullfinch, the brambling, and the redpoll, which I've pictured eating nettle seeds in the winter. A bird-friendly garden should offer 5 a day, and you shouldn't be afraid of sharing with the birds either. Fair share, as we say in permaculture, fair share also with nature, not only with people. And it's always a joy in the winter to share with birds like the blackcap here, which is increasingly overwintering. Never goes on bird feeders, but feeds on fruit that we're growing in our gardens, and you can improve things for that particular species. They both eat apples, yew berries, elderberries, and quite a few others. In fact, I've made a list of the different species. This is unfortunately in Norwegian, of the different species of berry and fruit plants that I have in my garden, and which bird species I've recorded or seen eating those fruits. And by far the most important as far as bird diversity is concerned is the rowan, the first line there, with 11 different species. Some species eat the fruit, other species eat the seed of rowan. And for me, diversity is the whole way important. So the whole year I try and have as diverse a diet as possible. And there's no exception with the fruit and berries. I grow a large range of different fruits and berries. Some of them are sweet tasting, others are quite sour tasting. So there's a huge range in the similar way, and in a similar way to the mixed vegetable salad. You can make a mixed fruit salad, and I turn the autumn fruit, often 20 fruits and different fruits and berries together into a fruit leather. So you basically cook up and put them in a tray and dry them in this form. And that makes every year a distinct fruit leather, which has a different flavor from year to year, depending on what species are available at the time I'm making this. So since lockdown, I've recorded 276 species of butterfly and moth, 47 species of diptera, including 27 different hoverflies, 15 species of bees. I'm sure that's a large underestimate. Some of these groups of insects are very difficult to identify, and many parasitic wasps, which are almost impossible to identify. Thank you to the many entomologists who've helped me along the way here. This is a work in progress, but it really is pleasing for somebody that started off with an interest in nature, bought a garden which was nature friendly. Over the years, it turns out, created a forest garden with this incredible biodiversity. A big biodiversity, which to a large extent is due to the fact that I have a large diversity of the food plants for these insects. Yeah, but one of the absolute key species in my garden, which is perhaps sometimes neglected in forest gardening, is the goat willow, or Salix caprea. Many of you are aware of the fact that bumblebees and some wild bees coming out of hibernation in the early spring are dependent on food from the flowering willow trees. And it turns out that it's much more important than that. And I've actually, this was a tree I was going to fell because it wasn't really useful as a food plant. But when I discovered that there was this enormous range of both the wild bees, bumblebees, and in particular moths, all these moths are associated with willow in my garden because I have quite a few. I've kept a number of part of the garden relatively wild. It attracts these moths in the early spring. So middle of April, the willow is flowering, and some of the species also have larvae which feed on willow leaves even. So a hugely important tree to have in a nature-friendly, permaculture-friendly garden. And it appeared, then I realized that the middle of April, when the goat willow is flowering, is also the time when the migratory birds start to appear almost exactly at the time that the goat willow is flowering. And that's no accident. It's a time when the food supply for these insectivorous birds are also available. I'm sure that is also keyed in a large way to the flowering of the willow. So we've got a whole huge ecosystem built around this one plant. Okay, to finalize, just very quickly about the other two gardens I'm working on. In the city of Trondheim, at the Botanical Gardens, which is called Ringve Botanical Garden, it's part of the university, NTNU. I forgot to mention early on, I'm not a biologist. In fact, I gave up biology at school when I was 15. But through my interest, I decided to take early retirement. I worked as an ocean wave climatologist over my lifetime for about over 30 years. And I decided finally it was time in 2017 to take early retirement and concentrate my time on working with plants. And I was bowled over to be offered a research scientist or visiting research scientist position at the Botanical Gardens that same year. And the background for that was that I'd been working on a project for the Norwegian Genetic Resource Centre, collecting old Norwegian perennial plants. And one of the major groups of perennial plants were the onions. Over a 10-year period, I collected something like 90 old Norwegian onions, which were used for food across the country, from the very far south, Lindesnes, to North Cape in Finnmark. And these plants needed a final resting place, if you like, and it was decided, well, we got money to develop this onion garden at the Botanical Gardens in Trondheim. So the last 6 years, I've been working on developing this garden, which has a huge diversity. It has both the Norwegian onions, a couple of them I've already mentioned, Allium victorialis and Scorodoprasum, plus 7 or 8 others. It has all those local varieties with their local stories attached to them. But also we've planted another 300 or so cultivars of alliums species. We have about 100 species of alliums, and these are all growing outside in Trondheim in Norway. So many of these alliums are very well cold adapted. And looking from above, you could just see the diversity of these alliums. The allium genus is the genus that I really am. It's my favorite genus of all the plants because of its diversity. There are something like 900 species over the Northern Hemisphere, a few in the Southern Hemisphere as well, but they're not hardy. And some flower in the springtime, some flower in the summer, and some flower right up until the first frosts. And so there's always something of interest in the onion garden, which we call Chicago because the North American or Native American name Chicago actually means stinky old place in the forest. So Chicago was built on a place where, or was established on a place where there were millions of onions growing originally. In particular, Allium cernum, the nodding onion, which is one of my absolute favorite perennial onions, which can be grown more or less anywhere in Scandinavia. The nodding onion, which I somehow forgot to include in my talk, but there you go, it is now included. And the second garden I'm working on is a community garden called Varieties, which is on about halfway between where I live, 17 kilometers from the city centre, to the botanical garden. So it fits very well in with my bike ride to town. I can stop and work a bit at the community garden and then end up at the botanical garden, do a bit of gardening. So I'm a full-time gardener these days. But the community garden was based on a concept of basically a large farmer's field, which we rent. And the idea was to develop like a paradise for people and for nature, insects, birds, you name it. Along one side of the field, we have an established alley of old trees already in place. And over the last, we started in 2017 here also. And over that time, we've planted around about 250 different edible shrubs or mostly edible shrubs and fruit trees. We've planted walnut trees and many more. So here I've had more or less free rein to develop this within the constricts of it also being a place where people are growing traditional vegetables, but I'm trying to creep in, bring in as many perennials as possible. And yeah, I have a lot of support in doing that. So we're thinking of this eventually will be like a big forest garden. And one of the gardens within the community garden is this large 12-meter diameter circle, which we call the World Garden or Verdenshagen. And this is basically based around the concept of my book, Around the World in 80 Plants, where you can imagine the center point of the garden, where you can see a pile of rocks that represents the Arctic and the mountains of the world, if you like. So I've planted a number of Arctic plants there. And around the circle, one part of the circle, here is Europe, here is North America, here is Japan, and on this side we have parts of Western Asia, etc. And I've planted the plants then geographically so they fit into where they grow or where a story associated with that plant is associated. So this plant, so far we've planted about 150 different plants in this garden. My book, by the way, does include many more than just 80. There are other closely related species. So this is the World Garden, which is also a lot of fun. So it's my book in a compact form of my book. So I think that's about it. So thank you very much. Dominic's gone to sleep, I think. Hello, Dominic.
No. It's too amazing to fall asleep. No.
You got black. I thought you turned the light out.
No, it's all good. It's all good. Yeah, listen to it and looking up all the plants.
With you. Okay. Yeah, so I hope that fulfilled the bill for tonight. As I say, I could have gone on for another 8 hours, but yeah, we've got other things to do.
We will invite you for another time and then go for the whole marathon.
think I'm too old for that now.
Okay, with breaks over some days, no worries.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, this is where we part from the streaming. I will stop the recording now. And
Yep.
then we have question and answers.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Yep, bye-bye.
All the YouTubers.